So now we figured out intersex competition. But what about intersex competition? How would an individual actually figure out whether this beauty is worth passing on, the genes of this beauty are worth passing on or not? So now we're going to look at the second part, which is mate choice. How to actually figure out who to mate with. Let's have a look.
Darwin was very specific that there's the separate process, so the intersexual competition, the intersex competition, that now puts females in a very active role. Because now females, they have options of deciding whom to mate with. So how do we explain mate choice? The most straightforward option is maybe there's some direct benefits. So maybe my mom decided, oh wow, this young gentleman over there is looking very handsome, and he is quite handy with all the tools, and hooray, we can build a beautiful little house together to take care of our amazing little offspring. Right, so this is the place where I grew up, for example. So the idea here is that maybe females in all the different species may choose males typically because they think they can provide some specific resource like food, or provide territory or other resources, you know, like when we think about humans, often wealth or education, that help to ward off threat and help to take care of offspring, right? So here the task really is for females in animal kingdom to detect the signals that would indicate these resources. Pretty straightforward idea. They're pretty good. There's pretty good evidence and support for those kind of models through observations in animals where both males and females invest in offspring. So typically females tend to choose males that show signals that they will also care for offspring to some extent. Right. There are some kind of complications, because this will also open up the opportunities for cheats and for like fake displays of yeah, sure, I will care for it. There are some really fascinating animal studies out there, but yeah, that's probably too much of a digression. The main issue here is those models have been pretty well supported. Then there are all sorts of indirect benefit models where most likely females choose males with some kind of indirect benefit. So if you think about it though, it is not necessarily always obvious what would be that benefit. So again, let's have a look at our beautiful little bowerbirds.
This outdoor picnic has an avian invader, but this satin bowerbird isn't interested in snatching food. He's stealing straws for love. This Australian songbird lives to lure females to his bower, an avenue of sticks built with one purpose in mind: mating. But no self-respecting female is going to set foot in this bare-bones bachelor pad. He needs to redecorate. And he knows what the ladies like. Blue is their favorite color. This female is not particularly impressed. To win her heart, he'll have to up the ante. Now that's a big spender. Finally, the female allows herself to step inside his love nest. Male bowerbirds have an elaborate mating dance. But for this female, a ring seals the deal. At least until the next girl comes along.
This is where we have to come back to a basic genetic explanation or process. Again, you guessed it, good old Fisher. He had his fingers in there. He suggested that there are so-called runaway processes operating that set animals up on really weird trajectories. What you need for the runaway process by Fisher is essentially an ornament and a preference by the females. And so what happens is there needs to be an ornament that distinguishes between individuals of one sex, and that ornament could potentially first have some kind of natural selection advantage, but not necessarily so. But it needs to distinguish reliably between individuals of the one sex, and then females need to have a preference through whatever reason for one specific type of or ornament, and then what happens is the gene for the ornament and the preference for that ornament become linked in the offspring. And then what happens is, as these preferences play out, and so the next generation of females will again prefer males with this particular ornament and a more extreme version of that ornament, and the preference also became stronger. So then the next generation will of course then even more desire this ornament, and there will be animals with even more fantastic ornaments. And so what we have here is kind of a runaway spiraling process where the animals become weirder and weirder. So if you look at a peacock flying, dude, this is challenging for the bird to stay in the air. So it makes it quite difficult. So we have a runaway process, and the only way that this now can be stopped is at the extreme ends through natural selection, where those animals that have ornaments or behaviors that are too extreme and expose them to too much of a risk, they would be weeded out by natural selection again. So it's a runaway process that only stops once natural selection kind of steps in and rules out the most extreme variations of this kind of ornament. So this is Fisher's runaway process, and it probably just shows that, like we often think about evolution to be this kind of wonderful, marvelous kind of mechanism that makes animals better, smarter, better fitted. Well, actually, probably this is just one of the best examples of like evolution doesn't really care about any of that. Evolution is a weird process that just happens and leads to some kind of outcome, and then it may not actually have to be very adaptive or like potentially improve fit in a way. So always remember, evolution is a weird thing. There's no purpose in evolution. Right. But this now also brings us to so-called conditioned dependence dependent indicator models, or the so-called handicap principle. Similar to the Fisher runaway problem, we have ornaments and we have preferences, but there's an important additional feature, which is a viability trait. So again, we have the ornaments, and we have females that will prefer males with these more fantastic displays. But the idea now is they select those animals with the more fantastic displays, because these kind of wasteful signals mean that the male is able to actually invest all these resources in these feathers, or in these like mating nests, that show that the animal has the resources and the genetic fitness to be well off, even though it is investing in all this kind of crazy nonsense. So, for example, if you think about it, again, bringing in parasites and diseases, if you are infected with parasites, or like with diseases, blood diseases, for example, here's a study by Hamilton, good old Bill Hamilton, that we talked about in the introduction sections, and Marlene Sook in a paper published in Science. What they looked at is the bright feathers in these passerines, North American passerines in different national parks, and their birdsong, and they looked at the preference for bright feathers and active bird songs, and this kind of male showiness among females, and the presence of parasites. And what they found was that in environments that had a higher prevalence of parasites overall, females preferred males with brighter plumage and with more show-off kind of bird songs more, and so there was a stronger connection, right? Because the idea is, if we come back to the peacock as well, the peacock has all these beautiful feathers. This is like a signal that your genes are really good. You're able to produce all these fantastic colors. Your body is good, so you have good genes, and therefore you can produce these kind of wasteful ornaments. And this is what an Israeli geneticist called Ahmad Zahavi called the handicap principle. So, where these kind of sexually selected traits function like honest but costly signals that indicate gene quality. And so the signal really that you have this amazing tail is that it signals the animal is fit enough to keep this ornament or trait and compensate for the fitness reducing handicap, right? So if you don't have these good genes, then you wouldn't be able to produce this amazing peacock tail. So this is the handicap principle, or an indirect condition dependent indicator model. And as you notice as well, again, parasites come in all the time. Parasites most likely are one of those important drivers, and we will come back to parasites again and again. Parasites, diseases, are one of the major drivers of evolution. So just think about also, again, what's happening right now with the pandemic that we're living in, and how that differentially affects countries around the world in the kind of behavioral changes that are being adopted. But getting a bit away from the whole idea of sexual selection here. So we had basically direct benefit models, we had indirect benefit models, and whenever we talk about evolution, we also have to think about byproducts. And so one of the arguments is that all this kind of these plumages, this amazing the amazing efforts that go into, for example, the production of these nests are just weird exploitations of sensory system features in the brains, for example, of these poor little birds. And so essentially it's like a byproduct. One person who could potentially be put into this camp is Richard Prum with The Evolution of Beauty, a recent book that created quite a few waves, because he takes the runaway selection method by Fisher, and then he combines it with essentially some feminist female autonomy argument to argue that sexual selection has actually provided an impetus for female agency in the animal world, and therefore also in the human world, that probably would not be there if there was only natural selection. And his argument is that a lot of the rejection of sexual selection also comes from the fact that it doesn't fit with traditional gender roles in the societies where this theory was proposed, or the dominance of males, and therefore the true implications of sexual selection have not been taken up because of that. Really fascinating argument, and he puts kind of sexual selection back to where, you know, Darwin to some extent had put it in 1871 with his book, because a lot of the other principles, like for example the handicap principle, are an attempt to bring sexual selection back into the realm of natural selection, where the sexually selected ornament is actually an indicator for a good gene that is being processed via natural selection principles. Right? So this is where there's a lot of discussion and confusion whether sexual selection is actually a truly independent evolutionary force, or whether it is potentially a specific type of natural selection in the context of mate competition for reproductive success.